Masterminds have been around for a long time, right? But unless you had a bunch of extra income to throw at it, you couldn't be a part of it. Well, we wanted to solve that problem. And so we're bringing masterminds to you for free. Welcome to Mastermind for the Masses. Nice. So how's the week been, guys? Anything major that you want to call out? Any big accomplishments this week?
I took a week of PTO, baby. That's my big accomplishment.
Hey man, you gotta do that sometimes. Honestly, self care and recharge your batteries.
Yep.
You do anything fun on the PTO?
A new expansion for a video game that I play called Path of Exile came out, so I've been grinding that a bunch. It's a guilty pleasure of mine that I like to do in my free time, so it's been a lot of fun. But I don't take PTO nearly as frequently as I should, so it's been nice. Definitely looking
Good,
forward to the rest of the week.
nice. And you still took time out for the pod, which I love and I appreciate.
Yeah, this doesn't work.
Yeah, it's true. This is fun. Shan, what about you, man? Anything cool this week?
Same old. It's Q4 for me, so my life pretty much sucks until January.
That's the
So
goal. That's the
honestly,
goal.
yeah, honestly, no, I've really just been. I locked myself in the garage for a few hours this weekend, just knocking out some orders and printing up some T-shirts. That's about it.
Yeah, man. So, I mean, obviously, this time of year, especially with your businesses and especially around that e-commerce, you're slammed, right? So, do you think like communication's ever an issue, right? With either your customers or, I know you've got a couple businesses, so obviously you're probably going back and forth with different people. Does communication get more challenging the busier you are?
Yeah. I mean, the one of the main brands I co-own, I have a partner with, so me and him, we have a pretty strong communication system. But when it comes to like Q4, you kind of see that shift off a little bit because we're both kind of slammed doing our own things. He's the head of operations and fulfillment for one of the brands, and I'm myself for the other one completely run it independently. So, like when things kind of hit the fan, like and I feel like that's everywhere, right? Like when things are crazy, you're less focused on like chatting with each other, and you're more focused on like the objective at hand. But yeah, I would say around this time of year, whether that be like communications with customer, because that is also blowing through the roof, and then just communication with your other colleagues, like it adaptively changes throughout the year for sure.
Does it get crazy because of, like an increase in like sales or orders, or is it just because like you got like obviously the holiday season where everyone's like, either like spending time with family, like vacations come up, or is or like which one of those two would you say it is, or is it something like completely different?
Yeah, no, I would say it's both. Because you got a lot. I mean, usually around the holidays, you have a lot going on personally on top of your professional careers. And it's really like, I guess um, it depends on the category of work you do, because a lot of places will slow down during the holidays, and then other places will be complete mayhem. But um, but yeah, no, I mean, other than like really just the increase of like site visitors, increase of emails, increase of all that, like that's it, it really it's the same that I'm used to dealing with, just all concentrated like in a 2 month time span.
Mm,
Yeah. So
gotcha.
the reason I asked that question is because we actually had a message come in to our system here around that similar topic, right? So this is from an anonymous submitter, but they basically said, "What do you do when you're in a work environment where communication lacks?" But then there's a second part, right? So obviously we talked about communication, but then Shan, I think you hit on this too, right? Uh, what if you have a leader who isn't able to really lead well because they have limited knowledge of your position? And do you think that's this isn't part of their question, but do we think that that knowledge of the role is a requirement to be a good leader? I think we've got a lot to dissect from that. And super thankful to our listeners for sending that in. But Colby, any initial thoughts?
Hmm. That's a tough one. I mean, obviously context matters in every situation, but I think it really depends on what role you serve or like are, doing inside of whatever company you're working for, just because if you're kind of like the new person like coming in and you're in a position that really isn't, it's like more of like, I guess, like your grunt worker, if you just to use like a random term, like it's not like an assistant manager, it's not a manager role, it's just like you're basically assigned to like do a job, you do that job, and like you kind of just see things kind of falling apart around you. I think it's owning your immediate area of control as much as possible is, I think, the most effective strategy in that or in that instance, because your zone of influence may not be that expansive. And if you try to interfere in, or not interfere, but like if you try to kind of like help with things that really are outside of your control, it can sometimes be more of a hindrance than a help. But I think if like you kind of like, if no one has any issues or any like they don't have to worry about anything that's within your realm of control, I think that just provides like so much stability to like a team environment that it allows other places to get the help that's needed to be brought up. But obviously that's just like one example. Like I think if you have a more, influential role within a team, that's a different situation.
So it's interesting you talk about the influence, right, and where your zone expands, because this question that we got sent in asks about your leader not having, or them having limited knowledge about what you're doing. But I suppose it goes both ways, right? I mean, as an individual contributor or working on the line, you may not necessarily know everything that's going on politically, holistically, right? And that can sometimes be a challenge too, which is why that communication, if it's lacking, becomes so important. Because without communication, you're left to make assumptions, and we all know what happens with assumptions, right? So, I mean, how can you really kind of maybe fill in those gaps that are there? I mean, you have to be intentional about it. Shan, do you have strategies around that? I mean, you communicate with all of your customers. You must have some strategies.
No, I think what you said is a good point, and I think you're right. I think one question answers the other. So, like, how do I communicate with a leader who might not be familiar with the work I'm doing? Well, he or she is probably not familiar with what you're doing because of the lack of communication. And that's a tough one too, that question on its own, because to Colby's point, like it depends on context. Like if everyone just prefers the work independently, then that approach is completely different from maybe just the atmosphere or the environment's not set up correctly. So I would you'd almost have to treat communication like an investment. It might be something that kind of feels forced at first, or something that you really don't like know if you can use as like building blocks to make the environment better. But unless you actually try it out and shoot your shot with your team, or send a few messages out, or try to like do some one-on-ones or group together, you really don't know how effective communication can be until you do it. And fortunately, like I'm always in an environment where communication's pretty easy, but I also feel like that's probably because I've witnessed like the value of like investing in communication, because some people can just rant, some people can just talk without having any like focus or subject to what they're saying. And that I could see that being like a con to communication, and might be the only reason some people treat it as like something that could be really good or something that can be a waste of time. So I mean, for me, really a strategy would just be like forcing it as an investment and seeing what kind of result you get and going from there. Because really, like if your question's about your manager or your boss or your leader not knowing what's going on in your role, then like just force a chat that kind of allows you to have a conversation about what you're specifically doing, what they're doing, and like just keep each other updated, right? Like even if that'd be like a call out or like a group session one-on-one or whatever it takes, really. I mean, if I was in that situation, that's what I would do. I would just kind of like force the environment to where we'd be chatting about it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that like a lot of it comes down to like you need to be willing to like state things that everyone's kind of like afraid to say. Like it's kind of like a bull in a china shop almost to some degree. It's just like, where it's like stepping on eggshells is a better analogy. But I think you just need to be not necessarily blunt, but I guess more straightforward with like if if you're noticing something and like information isn't being conveyed when it should be, the leader within your organization isn't noticing things that maybe they should, and then just haven't, like it's like you have to make a decision. Do you want to try and change things for the better, or do you not want to rock the boat? And I think it definitely is context dependent, but like at the end of the day, it's definitely like it's possible for you to like speak up and say something about it, right? Like if I notice something occurring in the workplace, or there's some sort of like breaking communication between the people I work with, or the people I work with and my direct manager, like it'd probably be something where I'd go to my direct manager and talk to them about it and like say, hey, like I'm noticing these and this things. Like I'd ask them questions about what they're seeing and what they think, and ask their opinion. I think that's really important, is if you're working with a leader or manager who doesn't have strong sort of leadership skills, like I think that's when, funnily enough, like being a great follower is a great skill set to have, because sometimes the best way to get someone to lead is to like ask questions and provide like poignant like feedback and like observations that you're seeing in the workplace. Like especially if you're a new person coming in, I feel like you can come in and like see so many things and like bring it up to your direct boss, etc., and then kind of like ask them questions and get them thinking about it. So it's just like that one thing stirs their brain, then things can change. But that would be kind of my direct approach.
So I think you hit the nail on the head with the fact that you have to sometimes lead up, right? And you can do that by following and really serving in that role. But when I look at this question, right, I think there's a potential risk here, with that leader having limited knowledge about the role that they do. It could be difficult to ask questions, right? So you kind of have a potential roadblock there in the communication. But then also going back to Shan's analogy of it being an investment, right? Even because communication is two-way, right? So imagine if you were trying to make that investment, but for lack of a better term, right, the bank is closed, right, or the exchange rate isn't accurate. So it's not really correlating. You got to have somebody to receive that investment for it to actually be worthwhile. So what if nobody is receptive to the investment that you're making, right? Is it,
Yeah, that's why it kind of like, to the point, like it all depends on context, because it could be an environment issue. Like communication could be the result of what the real problem is, which could be the lack of a good environment, or just straight up leadership too, as well. You could have someone who doesn't prefer to communicate things, and they lead independently, which I would argue isn't even a form of leadership. But I don't know. Like it really depends on context for that, because if you're really like lacking it in your environment, you can't feel that like communication. When I say it's an investment, like you feel that even if you force it, or even if you try to push conversation and get results, and things just like they're at a dead end or standstill, or people are looking at you like why are you why are you bothering me kind of thing, then it definitely becomes more of like an environment issue. So I mean, it's not like you can make communication work in any scenario. Usually it does, especially if you have people receptive to communicating to you back. But unfortunately, I don't think you could like beat a dead horse with it.
Yeah, I would say too, on top of that, it's I think there's a lot of situations too where I feel like if you didn't feel like your manager was really competent at really what their functions or role should be, and they don't really have a lot of understanding of like what you're doing, I mean, at a certain point, I feel like you have to evaluate whether or not their influence or action is needed to the same degree that you would expect of maybe a different person. Because like say like I mean, I would almost like kind of start to evaluate like, okay, like, well, if they're not familiar with this and we have this problem, like let's create a plan on how to address it, basically, and then like almost like bring a proposal to them. Like I feel like that is also helpful, and you kind of like, it's almost like a cost benefit analysis of implementing a change or implementing um, a feature or anything like that. Like I think could be useful. But also I think there's a lot of time where like you can just, depending on your environment, you could just act and do something without needing to necessarily involve them depending on the scope of what it is that you're doing. So I guess honestly, it would kind of depend on, I guess the exact nature of your relationship with the manager and the relationship with your coworker. I don't know. It's a tough one.
Yeah, and there's, of course, asking forgiveness instead of permission works better in some environments than others. Um, so let's say you're in this environment, right, with this structure, whether it is, but communication isn't being super successful. What options do you have on the table?
Mm, I mean, again, I think for me, like at least in my experience in a couple jobs that I've had, is that because I feel like I've run into this before, and to me, the answer has always just been to, if it's like really impacting my job, is to just take more ownership over the decision making and like actions of my job. I mean, it again, but I was like in a situation where I had a lot of agency in these jobs. Like I had a lot of control where it's like, hey, like, you don't need to come to my uh desk for like permission to like do XYZ, right? And so I kind of like had a clearer scope of like what was in my realm of responsibility. So it was a lot different in those situations. But I mean, I do know that there exists like more corporate environments where you can't always act that way without getting into a lot of trouble, because they don't want you to just do something random that wasn't approved by the company. So, and I think that's where it starts to get really difficult, because I think the former is a lot easier to deal with because you have more agency. I'm honestly not sure what I would do in a situation where I didn't have that agency. I mean, I guess I would have to resort to, again, communicating with my direct boss on like what I'm seeing, and just try to outline the problems as clearly as I could so that they could understand why it's a big deal, and try to implement change that way through like building a relationship with them, and sort of like almost like teaching them like what's going on would maybe be my approach. But I think at a certain point, when push comes to shove, like whenever you are working for someone, it does, like when you interview, like you should be concerned about what culture you're getting yourself into, what your role and scope is in the organization, etc. Yeah.
Sometimes that can be difficult to know, though, right? So I'm thinking back into my past for a minute, and I did work for an organization for a very long period of time. And when I first got introduced into it, the culture was really healthy. Communication was there. It was a viable environment, and that's the reason why I was there for an extended period of time. But ultimately, towards the end, probably the last 18 months or so that I was there, things changed. A lot of micromanagement came into play, so we weren't empowered, like you were talking about, Colby, and having the ability to actually take action and solve problems. And that's difficult for me, right? Because I like to be a problem solver. So kind of restricting me, and not that I can't fall in line with instruction and rules. I mean, I've done that for all of my career, right? But in general, I also like to. I feel like I've operate in a way that it creates a lot of trust and produces results that are wanted, and so there's value there. So when you start to be in an environment where you can't influence that, right? Because I was trying to lead up, I was trying to do everything we're talking about, and it just was not happening. The upper leadership um, was not hearing folks, because it wasn't just me, right? There were numerous people kind of trying to do the same approach. And what it ultimately led to was a loss of a lot of great talent. And if I can sound boastful for a second, including me, right? And at a certain point, I think it's important that you have to realize, that your options are semi-limited, right? You can either accept it and stay there, you can try to ignore it, or you have to decide to leave. And I think it's important when you're making that consideration that you don't just leave, but you actually go somewhere. Like that's so key, I think. Um, you know, when I made the decision that it was time to go, I didn't just jump ship at the first opportunity I had. I really went and tried to find something that I thought would align with what I was trying to do personally and professionally, as well as would give me the opportunities to grow more.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense.
Shan, I know you've done a lot of your businesses kind of solo, but I know you've also had some employees along the way, right? And I know that you've also left other roles that you've had. So, like, what's a determining factor for you when it's time to either help coach someone onto their next role, or for you to decide, this is like, do you have a line in the sand when you're like, okay, I need to find a new place to go?
Yeah, I mean, it's not often that I've been put in that position, to be honest with you. But in the times that I have, it usually comes down to the environment, which is probably why I use that as an example on what the real issue could be, because that's the first thing that came to mind. Because it's really hard for anything to not work when you have a good environment. Because if you have a good enough environment, really communication is going to be receptive. So is like feedback and kind of just any ideas you might come up with, or any like change of management might come through, and it really won't affect too many things, because when you have a good environment, that's kind of hard to break. But at the same time, it's when it is broken, it's quick to come as well. So, and like the situation you mentioned yourself, like unfortunately, like there's not too many things that can come across and turn that kind of environment into a place where, like, for instance, this user might ask a question where how do I communicate with my direct boss, when it doesn't seem like the communication already exists. So, like, long story short, really, for me, like the line in the sand would be the environment for sure, because again, like if things aren't the way I'd prefer them to be, but if the situation and the environment is set up to where that can easily be like voiced, and not only can that be voiced, but like actual action can be taken towards it, then becomes like an opportunity to completely like put things around, especially when it comes to communication too. Because I talked about it being an investment. Like, does it feel like an investment in your environment? Because if you suggest something, or you act a little bit more communicative than most of the team would, will it be like received well? If it's not received well, then like that's when the question becomes like, all right, if it's an investment, like what are the risks? What are the potential outcomes? Like it just puts you in that situation to where the environment controls everything. So I know that's a long drawn out answer, but in reality, like that's it for me. Like if it's a good environment, I feel like I can make anything work to my favor.
And that leads back to kind of what we talked about at the beginning, right? When this question was posed, obviously the environment is so key. So what I kind of took from everything that you both said was, if you have a good leader, one that's going to trust and empower you, and create an environment where, you can kind of have some of that control to really help things along, it can still be a healthy communicative environment, even if they don't fully understand what you do. But the opposite isn't true. So if you have a bad environment and a bad leader, even if they knew everything about your job, right? I don't think that you would still be happy there, right? Because even if communication was a lot, because you could still have communication even if it's not fantastic. But you could have a lot of communication. You could have someone that knows everything about your job. But if the leadership and the environment is bad, your experience is going to be bad.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that comes back to the investment too, right? Like, are you investing in like Google, or are you investing in like Dogecoin? Like by that, like, is if you're gonna jump out there and like try to create a communicative environment, or communicative environment in a bad setting, like you're investing in the wrong place, unfortunately.
True. I also think too,
in case you're not. Sorry, I was just going to say, in case you're not into tech and an entrepreneur, Dogecoin is cryptocurrency. So
Yeah, no, I mean,
What are
I
you gonna
definitely
say?
think. Oh no, I was just gonna say like I definitely think like that's a bit like environment. I think is probably like the number one thing for everyone. But I also think, at least in my experience, it also depends on where you're at in your career. Because like I think if you're just starting off in like a field, or you're still relatively new to a company or like an industry, like I can definitely imagine situations where you're willing to put up with a lot more than you would if you were like sort of like well into and established and have a solid resume, and you like when you have your pick of the litter, like this one company isn't the end all be all for like your starting point into like an area. Like you have a lot more flexibility. But if it's the opposite, then I would definitely. I mean, this is my personal opinion. I would really, unless it's like super toxic, and there are definitely situations where that's the case. If you are getting extremely good experience anywhere, then I would personally tough it out. Like I definitely am a big fan, and I don't think this gets stressed enough to people, especially young people today. It's not all, sunshine and rainbows, in the workforce and the workplace. Like it's like I feel like especially when you're starting off, like you have to do a lot of things that like aren't super fun, aren't super glamorous, aren't like, all that sexy. Like it's just it can be a grind. And there's definitely an unhealthy level to that. But at the same time, there is going to be some level of that, and you should learn how to tough through some things like that. But obviously there are exceptions. But it's just something I want to bring up because I think sometimes people get too zoned in on like everything being perfect almost like at their workplace, and it's just nothing's ever perfect, man. There's always going to be some sort of downside in most places that you work for. It's opportunity costs.
Yeah, I think you hit it there, right? I mean, there's definitely always going to be some negative no matter where you work. But if the negatives start to outweigh the positives, then life's short. And
Yep.
honestly, I mean, work is, you guys have heard me say this before, right? When we just are talking, but like work will eventually replace you, right? I mean, I appreciate, like, even in my personal career, I value loyalty. I appreciate the heck out of it, and I'm super thankful when I have team members that are there for that. But and I always know that in the same vein, right? Like the business is going to continue. It operated before I got here. It's going to operate after I'm here. So there's no point in me living a miserable existence in a role that I hate. If I get to that point, right, it's time to leave. And I think it just depends individually, because you're right. Sometimes you got to suck it up and dig through. And I think that's why I stayed for 18 months at the role that I had been at for so long, right? Because you're talking over a decade that I was at that role. And so I didn't want to just throw it away for, some bad hiccups or growing pains or whatever the case might be. But it got to a point where the negative outweighed the positive, and it was time for me to go. And again, that organization's still running, churning along. You know, so I have to do what's best for me, just like they would do what's best for them, right? Which was filling that role and moving on, just like I did.
And at the end of the day, like you're saying, it's a contract. What you sign up to work, it's essentially a contract, and you should always have the sort of cost benefit analysis of what you're doing, right? Like, because like me personally, like I may be willing to put up with a lot more than someone else for a given position for a given amount of time, and I willingly accept that, right? But if you're not, then yeah, like you shouldn't stay someplace where it's like your evaluation of the value you're getting versus the cost isn't appropriate, right? And I definitely feel like it's important to have that mindset going forward. I feel like if you're trying to like strive to improve or to sort of like, yeah, I guess just improve on like the professional skill, right? You always got to have that mindset.
So obviously, we talked a lot about kind of if you're already in the place. We even touched a little bit on coming in, but circling back to coming in or looking for a new role. Like, what strategies can you apply to really make sure that that environment's going to be different than the one you're trying to exit? What do you guys think about that?
That's a really tough one. I mean, it's got to be the interview questions. I think is one. I think you have to. What I would do is I would sit down and I'd probably write out what were the worst things at the last job I worked at for. Like, what were the absolute worst things that I would never want to experience ever again? Like, what were those things? And what would be a question that would help me sort of evaluate someone's. You can't get specifics, but you can get a feel. I think you can have a question that gives you, like, their response will give you a feel for how they think about and evaluate that specific thing. It could either not be on their radar, they could care very little about it, or they could be, they could care a lot about it. And like, that if there is an issue, they would put time into fixing that for you. Or you can kind of like evaluate the genuineness of their response as well. So to me, that would be probably my biggest thing. And I'm honestly not super great at doing that before an interview, because it's in the past, it's always been, I want the job so bad that it didn't matter what it was, honestly.
Yeah, but you bring up a good point, right? It's a two-way interview when you're in an interview. It's got to be a fit for both people. Shan, any at the end of almost every interview, hopefully all interviews, they ask you if you have any questions for them, right? Do you have any like go-to questions that you pull out during that part of the interview when they give you the opportunity to question them?
I like to feel out like a specific scenario. So like the last job interview I had, I believe the question I specifically got was, it was working with SaaS customers. So like the product, or the company was selling a product, an IT software to customers who they also managed, right? And I wanted to kind of throw an environment, or throw a question out there that might test like when an environment becomes a little bit more tricky. And so the question I asked was, I'm trying to remember it specifically. It was, since you hire technical people, since you hire people that have pretty extensive software engineering capabilities, and you manage all these customers, and these customers are, they're big clients with big contracts. What do you do in a situation where they ask you for a service that you don't normally offer, that isn't part of your package deal, and maybe not even correlates to your product? How do you handle those situations? And I ask in detail, right? So don't just tell me that, oh, we try to help them. Like, do you add that to a board somewhere? Do you track it? Do you write up a quote, or do you just do it for them? So asking that question, I was able to tell how how that specific environment works, right? So if it's like a drop all be all, these are super important customers, work overtime, figure it out, fit it into your schedule, then I know things might be a little bit more, or they could possibly be a little bit more hectic. Whereas if it's just like, oh, we'll research it, we'll get back to you, we'll speak with the team, we'll see if it's something that's even possible, then okay, you're probably looking at a company that kind of takes a slower approach to things, and makes sure that their people won't be overloaded by any like extra ask, even if there's like some dollar signs backed behind it. And I know that doesn't always work, especially when you're talking about like independent teams within a company. But that's just what kind of comes to mind. And to come back around to your initial question, so when I look for a position, like we talked about, Colby's answer being like the interview and kind of figuring out that environment. I don't generally ever look for a position. I look for a company, and then I hope to God that they have a position that relates to what I'm looking to do. So, for instance, like if I'm worried about the environment, which I almost normally would be, my thoughts were to be looking up companies that have verified ratings and reviews on Glassdoor, Salary, stuff like that, and kind of build your own rapport and do your own research before applying for that position, because it is tough to tell. But fortunately, we live in an age where all of that information is pretty public, so you can kind of get a feel for things ahead of time and kind of choose a company where you can get a sense of how the environment, or at least like how the employees are treated before you step into that interviewing stage. But I know that doesn't solve it for every scenario. There can be some one-offs where you work for a great company, but you work for a terrible person. So it's tough.
Yeah, sure. So I know we're all like in different like spots and have different perspectives, which is the whole power of the mastermind, which is awesome. I have a go-to question that I stole from somebody else years ago. But I think it's brilliant, and it accomplishes kind of the same thing that you're doing, Shan, but it has kind of twofold. So I'm going to share that, right? So now everyone's going to get the jobs I was applying for. But No, but the question was always a year from now, right? What will I have done to be successful in this role? And I always ask that question because it does two things. One, it puts me in the role in their mind. So I've already got the job, right? Sort of. So it's a little Jedi mind trick that I'm stealing. But the other thing is, I get to hear what their expectations are for me for that year. And so I understand more around what their core values are, what they really expect, because anybody can put words up on a wall, right? But I'm able to hear, well, we would expect you to have done, worked 80 hours a week and do all this type of thing. And that's not a job I'm going for. And granted, you kind of got to read behind the lines or read between the lines. They're not going to say, I want you to work 80 hours a week, probably. But, based on kind of their answer, you're actually able to draw out a little bit more about what that environment is and what the expectations really are. And do those align with what you want to commit to and are able to produce? And it kind of sets you up for more success, as well as, like I said, putting that little thought in their head that, you've already got the job.
Yeah, that's a good way to, if you're in the position to where you want to kind of dig, right? Like the question I mentioned earlier, that's a good one to kind of get a feel for what the person you're going to be working for is expecting out of you. So I like that one. I'm stealing that one.
Yeah, that's a good one. Definitely using that. Mainly just because, like, unless they have a really pre-prepared scripted answer, they're gonna only mention the things that are like the top three, right? They're gonna list the three. What are the three key things that this guy or girl needs to do to be successful in this role? Boom, bam, and then you have a much better sort of job description expectation framework to expect.
Yeah, it really helps you hit the ground running too when you start, right? Because you know exactly what's the most important. You get in there, you bang that out, and you're a rock star. Yeah. So, little tips from being super old. Enough interviews. But
so
Colby,
what do you think about this question then? Because, like, I think for a lot of people, like, say they don't have a lot of freedom to, maybe they don't have their pick of the litter in terms of jobs, right? So they have, like, say they have 3 jobs lined up and they can choose between any 3, right? And they want to make sure they are looking for the best option, but they want to make sure that they avoid the absolute worst, right? So, like, in my mind, probably I would ask something like this, right? Like, so what is your biggest challenge right now within the team, or like the role that I'm going to fulfill, and how do you envision me bringing value or solving that problem, that your biggest problem that you have essentially right now? Because, like, in my mind, I think the hardest thing to learn from an interview is you're getting like their best picture, like, right, they're trying to snapshot what the best images of that role, the company themselves, etc. But it's all roses, and you don't get to see, you don't get to get a peek behind the door or anything of what it looks like day in and day out operating the company. You don't know, like, what's you see the ceiling, what's the floor? And, like, to me, I'd want something that would show me what the floor would look like, just so I know, like, okay, if that's the worst that it gets, I can deal with that, no problem.
So I like the question, but I would probably phrase it slightly different, right? From my perspective, I would say, what's your biggest problem right now that I can help you with? So I wouldn't ask, how can I help you? Because that's why they're hiring me, right? To solve their issue. So I'm still going to get the same answer, but I'm selling myself to them, and I'm already confident, right? The way I asked it, I'm already confident I can solve the issue. Whatever the issue is, just tell me what your biggest issue is, and I'll tell you how I'll help you solve that, right? Because I just spent an hour probably in an interview selling myself to you anyway. So now I'm not going to ask you to tell me how I can help. I'm going to continue to sell myself and say, what is your biggest issue that I can help with right now? So I still get to see that floor, but I'm presenting myself in a more valuable way. So it's just kind of a little bit of a change in the wording, but that would be my approach. I don't know, Shan, what you thought when you heard that question, but that's kind of where my mind went.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, really. I mean, you kind of took the exact approach that, I being asked on the spot, that I would take, really, because the goal really is to sell yourself. And if I were to try to sell myself, it's going to be trying to really uncover what they're trying to buy, I guess, in reality.
So yeah, and so to circle us back, right? Because we've gone down this avenue. But if we go back to our listeners' question here, what do you do when you work in a work environment where communication lacks, as well as having a leader who isn't able to lead because they only have limited knowledge of your position? I think, what we kind of discovered is there's a couple of options, but really it boils down to, trying to lead up and influence that operation. And if that's not successful, then you have to really decide if you can live with it or if you need to leave. Right. And if you need to leave, hopefully, we provided some helpful strategies on what to look for and maybe how to set yourself up for the best chance to not wind up in the same situation. So hopefully that was helpful. I want to thank our listener for sending in that question. I want to remind everyone that if you have a question or something that you want us to discuss, super easy. Just send an email to gethelp@drjoshnelson.com. That'll come right to us. And if we select your question, we'll bring it on the air. Like I said, we'll keep you anonymous like we did today, unless you want to actually be shouted out. We'll do that. But so final thoughts on today's topic and conversation and question. Obviously we kind of covered it, that communication is key, but when communication isn't there, it's time to either accept it or leave. Right. So just want to give you guys the opportunity. If you have any final thoughts around this topic, Colby, start off with you, man.
Absolutely. I would say like one thing that we didn't touch on that I think is really important is it's very easy to be critical of others within a job that you have, but I would also stress it's important to be critical of yourself too and what you've done to influence the situation, both so that you can learn what you could have done differently in the future to yield a better result, and also like what you could have looked out for the next time, right? And also from the standpoint of like, even if it's like a skill set that maybe you lacked or wish you had during your time, take that time, set 30 minutes aside, 15 minutes aside, whatever that is, each day or every other day to improve yourself and improve at those skills, because that will only benefit you in the future so that you can maybe get a better job that doesn't have that environment that you were working in before. I think that's a really hard loop to get out of, is like going from crappy job to crappy job if you don't have the resume to get something better. And if you don't take the time to personally develop, that cycle is hard to get out of.
Definitely.
Yeah. I think what Colby said earlier really resonated with me too, about kind of analyzing the situation you're in. And if you're put in a situation to where things might not be perfect in like the communication sector, but other places are, kind of not necessarily stick it out, but analyze the situation you're in. Because if communication is lacking, but the environment's still good, the department's growing, you're really in the field that you want to be in, maybe kind of reprioritize it as something you do want to tackle. And again, like reapproach it as an investment standpoint, to where maybe it's not something that should be hyper focused on at the moment, but something that you want to at least uncover and work towards, like collaboratively with the team. And then take that approach as well, because again, like nothing's ever going to be perfect. And that's kind of where my stance is for an entrepreneur is I like to make the things my way at home and on my personal or entrepreneurial ventures. And then when I go to work, I kind of just, I don't ever duck my head, but I try to remember that things are the way they are for a reason. And if I want to change them, I should take a strategic approach, but I shouldn't be upset if things aren't perfect, because at the same time, like that's what my personal life is for. That's what my personal ventures are for, to put that kind of ideal environment in place for myself.
And that strategic approach is key, right? To kind of reiterate something I said earlier, but I think it encapsulates what you guys are talking about. You got to know where you're headed and where you want to be. And if the path right now is to endure and stay there for the experience or for whatever the opportunities might be, then that's what you have to do. And if the path is somewhere else, then you should not be afraid to take that path. But you should do whatever you're going to do with intentionality, right? If you're going to stick it out because there's value in it, do that on purpose. If you're going to leave, go somewhere. Don't just leave. Make sure that you're headed towards where you want to be, because ultimately life is short, and you might as well enjoy the ride. So that's it for today. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to Mastermind for the Masses, and we'll see you next week.
Take care.
See you.